Okay, so welcome everyone to this webinar. My name is Victoria Vogelsinger-Palm. I am the Deputy Director of the Southeast Europe Association, and I would like to welcome you all. And it is a great pleasure to see so many of you joining us for today's webinar, despite the end of the year rush, on this very important topic. 30 years ago, in 1995, the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina ended with the signing of the Dayton Peace Accords. So Bosnia and Herzegovina has been at peace for 30 years now. But the question remains, what kind of peace? Or whose peace? And exactly this question we want to discuss today with our distinguished panel. And first of all, I would like to introduce the moderator of today's discussion, Marika Djolai. Thank you for joining us. Marika is a visiting research fellow at the Department of Political Science and International Relations at the University of Peloponnese. And she is also, and which is very important, the coordinator and co-editor of our special issue on Bosnia and Herzegovina in our journal Südosteuropa-Mitteilungen, which will be published in the next couple of days. And she was also the one to assemble a group of authors with great expertise on Bosnia and Herzegovina to contribute to this special issue. Thank you for this, Marika. And these contributing authors are also here today as speakers. And I would like to welcome Nedžma Djananović. She's professor at the Faculty of Political Science at the University of Sarajevo. Welcome.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone.
Welcome, Vedran Džihić. He is a senior researcher at the Austrian Institute for International Affairs.
Thank you for having me.
Great to have you here. Sören Keil, he is senior teaching and research fellow at the University of Passau. Welcome.
Welcome. Thank you very much.
And last but certainly not least, Nikolaos Tzifakis. He is professor at the department. Actually, he's also professor at the Department of Political Science and International Relations of the University of Peloponnese. So you and Marika are somewhat colleagues here. So
thanks for the invitation.
Great to have you here, Nikos. Welcome and thank you all for joining us today. And actually, without further ado, I hand over to you, Marika. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here today, and it's always a pleasure to collaborate with, with your organization. And we had quite a few of these collaborations in the past years. And I'm also very happy to discuss this topic of 30 years of post-Dayton Bosnia and Herzegovina, and whether it's really peace or not peace. And it's very interesting that still 30 years after the war, which in the 90s horrified the world, Bosnia and Herzegovina is attracting a lot of attention from analysts, from experts, from countries, international actors. And all of us who follow Bosnia and Herzegovina have seen all this interest throughout the year. And people were trying to, to establish or to understand whether Bosnia's peace is successful or not. What did the country achieve? Where is the country going? I think that was the main motivation for our special issue, because somehow I personally, first time I lived in Bosnia and Herzegovina in 2004, which I came to work, which was barely 10 years after the war has ended. And I have been there for the past 20 years. I think the main motivation here is to really understand the complexity of what has Dayton Peace Agreement brought to Bosnia, and how did the country absorb the circumstances that the Dayton Peace Agreement either brought to the country or imposed on the country, depending on the view. And how is the country operating in this complex bubble? And in all of this, myself and the authors of this special issue are basically moving away from this binary approach. Is the peace successful or not successful? Has Bosnia achieved peace or has not achieved peace? And we have really tried to look into the complexity through two conceptual frameworks, if you like. One is the concept of hybridity or hybrid peace, which has become more and more prominent in the recent years, in the discussions, in the literature. And the second approach is to really try and to understand the epistemology of peace in Bosnia and Herzegovina, because if you look at everything that has been said or discussed just throughout this year, in connection to the 30 years of Dayton Agreement, we can see that there are many different versions of peace in Bosnia and Herzegovina, from institutions, politicians, citizens, international actors with interest or with less interest, expert journalists and others. And I feel that really the complexity still lies in somehow connecting all these different views and understandings of peace in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And for that, we offer some of our thinking of whether this all has worked together, and what is coming next in the future. So obviously, Office of High Representative is a keeper of this Dayton bubble that Bosnia and Herzegovina has been put in 30 years ago. And one of the authors of this special edition, Nedžma, Djananović, has framed the Office of High Representative less as an enforcer and more of a discursive gatekeeper of the Dayton Agreement and of Bosnia's peace. So maybe, Nedžma, you can tell us a little bit more about how do you see the situation today?
Well, first of all, I would congratulate all people from Bosnia and Herzegovina on 30 years of peace, and I firmly believe that Dayton Peace Accords did or has served its purpose in even a better way than anyone expected. Not only in terms of making peace, but also allowing say normal life to blossom in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and the fairly smooth implementation of peace in Bosnia and Herzegovina kind of testifies that everyone was ready for peace, and that most of the people, some politicians excluded, were actually very happy to implement, whatever solution, as long as the war was over. So sadly, though, in Bosnia and Herzegovina, the politics does not lead. So it is life, ordinary people, everyday needs that actually dictate and normalize the life. That's not necessarily always the message from the politicians, but that's also something that we have learned over the course of time. As for this particular text, I was very pleased to be a part of this team, and thank you once again for having me on board. It's been a pleasure. So in a way, yes, I did dive into the role of the Office of the High Representative, or the part of the role of the OHR, which is not often discussed. And that is not just in the usual or most common context, but also in the sense where the OHR regulates the political and symbolic boundaries of the two neighbors of Bosnia and Herzegovina, who are at the same time the signatories of the Dayton Peace Accords. For we often reduce the entire Dayton into its into the constitution of Bosnia and Herzegovina, but it's also about say the rights and the positions of the neighbors for the signatories. So they're not just neighbors or regional actors, but they're also co-signatories of the Dayton Peace Accords. And rather than focusing on what the OHR does in terms of legal powers or institutional reforms, this text was about how the OHR has, through the language and through the framing, through the narrative of the international community, acted as a continuous mediator and regulator of regional engagement. So this is what I see as a novelty, say, or a new angle. And as you go to this through this article, I hope that you will understand more about how the Office of the High Representative served as a gatekeeper. But also, I believe that understanding the narrative of the international community helps everyone better to understand not just the developments in Bosnia and Herzegovina or in the region, but also the transformation of international authority in this post-liberal era. And to answer this question or to respond to this task, I analyzed a unique empirical data set, the complete corpus of 67, in the meantime it's 68, reports of the High Representative submitted to the United Nations Security Council between 1996 and 2025. And these reports are, for many, considered to be, very dry bureaucratic documents. But actually, they are much more than that. They are instruments of political communication. They are addressed mostly to international stakeholders, and they are designed to justify the oversight. They interpret the developments. They signal international expectations. So it was very, very important to take these documents as narrative of the international community about its own engagement in Bosnia and Herzegovina, in particular relation to observing what the neighbors do. So it's not only about the formal powers that the OHR has in Bosnia and Herzegovina, especially through the bond powers, but it is also to the discursive role and the role of diplomatic language of the Office of the High Representative, for this role of kind of boundary maintenance when it comes to neighbors is not about sanctions. It is not about bond powers. Bond powers are reserved only for Bosnia and Herzegovina. But in order to, in a way, influence or to describe and interpret the role of neighbors, the OHR uses its diplomatic language. Through reading these reports and analyzing these reports, every single one of them, I identified the three key phases in the OHR's rhetorical treatment of Serbia and Croatia. The first phase from 1995 to 2006 where it appeals to them and describes them as co-signatories and also monitor partners. So the reports frame their cooperation or their involvement as necessary, but also conditional, and very often does OHR point to external direction or warn against external direction on the situation in Bosnia and Herzegovina. The period from 2006 to 2021 is fairly long, but it is also a period of a kind of depolitization and rhetorical gatekeeping. So as the international confidence in local ownership grew, we can discuss whether that was a bad or a good decision for that moment. The regional influence, the influence of neighbor, reemerged more subtly, particularly through the networks and through the symbolic diplomacy. So the OHR response to that was also using discourse rather than any kind of action. They basically monitored, they classified these developments, and they portrayed external influence as a source of democratic backsliding and often a kind of illiberal consolidation. So even before such trends were recognized in Europe. The phase 3 from 2021 to 2025 is the defensive gatekeeping, and going back to the language of crisis, which we have not seen in the OHR report since, say, 1996. So under Christian Schmidt's tenure, the reports adopted almost entirely a crisis narrative. Regional involvement is often framed as a direct threat to Bosnia and Herzegovina's sovereignty and its constitutional order. Serbia and Croatia both reappear as sources of destabilization rather than cooperation, and the OHR's language becomes more moralized, invoking often European values, but also the spirit of Dayton to justify its continued presence and engagement. So I basically argue that
can I just ask you quickly here?
Okay. Yeah.
Do you feel that at any point the discourse has changed towards the citizens of Bosnia and Herzegovina throughout these 3 decades? Because it certainly sounds like the conversation is more on the international side than to the actual people who live in the country.
Well, that was not part of this research, but many of these reports have actually been about not only describing the situation in Bosnia and Herzegovina, but also monitoring different types of civic engagements. So at more than few occasions in these reports, we can see different references from different high representatives to different civic initiatives, and also the claim that which is also fairly important, I would say, on the difference between what the politicians advocate for, regardless of the political parties, and the ethnic background, that it differs significantly from what citizens actually say or what citizens want or what different kind of NGOs lobby for. So more than few civic initiatives have found their place in the reports of the Office of the High Representatives. So even if, the ordinary citizens are not visible in political life that much, many of the initiatives were actually presented to the international community as important.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much for this opening statement. And Sören, if I can now come to you. You argue that Dayton achievements are often underestimated, and there are a lot of discussions about this. Maybe you can elaborate a little bit on this point and what did the agreement get right and what maybe it didn't?
Thank you very much, Marika. I think the main point of my argument is not to say Dayton is the best agreement in the world and let's run around and implement more Daytons in the conflict spots of today. But it seems to me that many scholars, and I include myself here, are very good at pointing out the flaws in Dayton and everything Dayton got wrong without putting Dayton into perspective of similar situations where peace agreements or peace negotiations have not had the same outcome. I don't think it should be taken for granted that we haven't seen any more large-scale violence in Bosnia after the Dayton Agreement. I also don't think we should take it for granted that Bosnia does have regularly elections, and these are competitive elections. We've seen changes of governments as a result of these elections. And we should not take it for granted that Bosnia is deeply embedded in the process of European integration, with all the flaws that process has and with all the limited progress Bosnia has made compared to its neighboring countries. However, I think when we put Bosnia in a more comparative perspective, right, and we look at countries that have followed a similar trajectory, then we have to, I think, be a bit more positive about Dayton than is often portrayed, right? Bosnia could be Iraq, right? We have not seen the widespread violence that we saw in Iraq after power sharing was implemented in 2005 to the same or to any extent in Bosnia. Right, but even if we take similar cases in Europe, right? If we take the case of Northern Ireland, where power sharing was adopted as part of the Belfast Agreement in 1999, here we see governing, making decisions, coming to agreements, forming coalitions is difficult in deeply divided societies, right? There's a reason why they had a history of conflict and why it was so difficult to come to a peaceful solution in the first place. And it seems to me if we embed Bosnia in this discourse, then maybe the perspective of Dayton should be a bit more positive than it is often portrayed. Having said that, this is not to say that Dayton did not institutionalize serious flaws. In the paper, I discuss particularly the power sharing architecture and the very problematic combination of a high degree of decentralization on the one side, where the entities and the cantons and the federation are the main forums in which decisions are made, and the strict power sharing requirements at the Bosnian central level on the other side. The two kind of completely contradict each other. You can very easily undermine the functioning of the central state because a lot of decisions are taken by the entities. So for those, as has been the case with the leadership of the Republika Srpska in recent years, that want to undermine the state and that want to demonstrate that Bosnia is not working and Bosnia is a failed state, the architecture within the Dayton Constitution allows that and makes that very easy. For me, the key challenge here is not so much which institutions or which mechanisms did Dayton get right or wrong. I think we have to admit that when you negotiate peace and when you settle a war that has been going on for some time, there will be things you will get wrong. And also there is a big issue of unintended consequences, right? Issues that come up that you couldn't foresee when you worked on the peace agreement. So it's not about, what institution is good, what institution is bad, what should have been done, how should it have been done. For me, the key issue with Dayton, and I think that is widely recognized, is the fact that it does not include clear time limits. To say, right, this is the framework to end the war. This is the framework to get the elites from the three main groups to work together. But after a certain period of time, we have to rethink this. We have to also domesticate the debate. We have to get an agreement that's not written 90% by American lawyers, but that is really based on the will of both Bosnian elites and Bosnian people. And it seems to me this is the big challenge and the big issue where Dayton failed and where the big problem with Dayton lies. But again, weigh that against the fact that it was able to build a lasting peace and to some extent implement a democratic competition. So how do you square the circle, I think, is a key challenge to think about. And how do you move beyond the unreformable Dayton framework? I think that's the key question to consider.
Thank you very much for that. And I was just looking today in preparation for this discussion, the Brčko final accord, which is part of the 5+2 agenda. And it's exactly, it has been written in 1999. It is American lawyers lingo. It has 70 points in the document. And of course, it still hasn't been implemented. But I think just one small question to you is how do you see the possible Dayton's adaptability when it's actually, it has not been integrated into it, as you rightfully pointed out?
There is a growing amount of literature that looks at power sharing, adaptability, and gives it increasing importance. And I think this is an important lesson we've learned from Bosnia. This idea that there's a good chance you will not get everything right when you agree at the power sharing settlement. So you need to have enough flexibility to correct whatever you get wrong later. Now, this is particularly difficult because coming to an agreement, to any kind of power sharing agreement, usually happens at a space where violence is still taking place, where everybody's still very much focusing on security, where you have a constant zero-sum logic in the negotiations. And Dayton is a very good example for that. So there were, from the perspective of the parties, but also from the perspective of American and European negotiators, there were good arguments to say this peace agreement should not be changeable easily, because we wanted to have a lasting effect so the parties also stick to it, because they feel that this is a framework that will not change overnight. Unfortunately, of course, it became such a straitjacket that it so far has proven more or less completely static and unable to change. With the exception of Brčko that you mentioned, the only constitutional change that we've seen to Dayton, the adding of the Brčko district. So how do you get out of this? And there are different ways in it. The very obvious one is to look at the Dayton Constitution. It does allow for constitutional changes. The April package 2006 got us closest to it, right? That was the most important attempt. And at the time, the April package did not fail because it was a bad package, right? It failed because some politicians basically tried to play power politics and thought they could get a better deal, or were already removing themselves from constructive engagement towards more spoiler behavior. And again, the Dayton architecture encourages that because you need so broad-based coalitions for any changes to the Dayton system. So if we then say, okay, April package was the closest attempt, and what happened after Budmir and other kind of attempts to change Dayton were not anywhere as successful as potentially the April package could have been, or anywhere close to getting to agreement. What other options are there? And there are different debates about this. Some people call for a Dayton 2, another big conference, to say, okay, we've done the post-war phase now, let's do the democratization and, state building, domestication phase. In theory, this sounds nice. I cannot see any international appetite by anyone to do that. Then there are lots of initiatives focusing on citizen forums, saying if any change happens, it needs to come organically from the bottom up. And there have been trials on this in Mostar and in other cities. And usually citizens are very keen to get involved and have lots of very good ideas on how Bosnia should change. The problem is this is not in line with the Dayton framework. So again, we have a legal political challenge here. So the third option, what I come to as a conclusion in the paper, is to say probably at the moment the best is some kind of incremental change, right? Change those things you can change and hope that they kind of like a spillover effect lead to more change. So for example, you can change electoral rules, right? This is an area you can change. You don't need constitutional changes. And that might lead then to other changes in the future.
Okay. Thank you very much for this. And let me go to you, Nikos, which your argument kind of, just continues from here. Because you, in your article, you identified the failure to genuinely transfer the ownership from international actors to local actors, but also that that Bosnia and Herzegovina has been captured by political elites and is in fact responsible for today's political stalemate, which Sören argued, any change is impossible under such conditions. So why do you, what do you see as the main challenges? And you also looked at the different stages of the Dayton Peace Agreement implementation.
Okay, thanks a lot for this question, for the opportunity to participate in this special issue. Now, a few words about the article first to put our audience, in the context. What I'm trying to do is to examine the engagement of external actors in Bosnia, and to do so for research purposes, I relied extensively on reviewing UN Security Council debates and also Peace Implementation Council's communique, decision statements, and to see how different countries position themselves in these major meetings and texts. So what I'm proposing here, what my main argument is that the international engagement has undergone three phases. In the initial phase, which lasted almost for a decade, from 1996 to 2005, the international community appeared united and committed to the success of the peace process. However, it failed to hand over ownership of the process to local decision makers. The second phase, which again ran for almost a decade, from 2006 to 2014, is marked by a debate over the termination of external governance. And here we're seeing the emergence of three divergent approaches, symbolically one proposed by the United States, one by Russia, and one by the EU. The bottom line is that the division of the international community has encouraged Bosnia's political leaders to question the progress made thus far. And finally, the third phase, from 2014 till our days, because probably we're seeing now the beginning of a fourth phase since President Trump's election. So the third phase has been marked by the entanglement of the country in the great powers confrontation. And here, beyond the Russian confrontation strands, we're seeing also China since 2021 questioning both the role of the West and the role of the High Representative. At this point, we should avoid any West versus others presentation of what's happening in Bosnia, the West has been divided since 2006 between the EU and the USA view, and also there are important differences between Russia and China, for example, on how China avoids to get enmeshed in Bosnia's domestic politics. The bottom line is that in this setting, it seems that the international community agreement on a new peacebuilding approach seems to be elusive, and nationalists in the country have been emboldened to escalate their divisive agendas. Going to your question on what is the impact on the political system, we are seeing that increasingly that the High Representative has turned from part of the problem in Bosnia to problem itself. For instance, if we see the discourse of SNSD, we're seeing that it's much more critical of the High Representative than of the Bosniak or Croat counterparts. So we're also seeing, on the other hand, on Bosniak parties that there is criticism of the HR of showing inconsistency or reluctance to openly confront secessionism and obstructionism in its daily work. So at the present, to sum it up, there is an awkward situation in which the High Representative increasingly lacks international support, and also domestically, it's becoming the focus of attention. And while in the past it was presumed that he was something like a deus ex machina that will intervene when it was absolutely necessary, at the present he's the main focus of criticism, especially from the Serb side. And we saw it in the recent presidential election in Republika Srpska, where again the HR's presence in the country was brought in a discussion.
In the context of what you're discussing here, the world has changed a lot since the Dayton Peace Agreement was signed 30 years ago, and we could argue that it has been particularly changing rapidly in the past decade. So how do you see now this complete changing field? And you talk about West versus the US, and certainly both the EU versus the US, and certainly both have changed a lot since the agreement was signed. So how do you, maybe again going back to the question of relationship between the political actors in the country that stayed pretty much the same, and then this rapidly changing world order, how do you see the impact of this, and possibly, the solutions to accommodate these changes?
Apologize for going frozen, and I missed surely most of the part of your question. I heard the last phrase. So how do we move forward?
No, the world has changed a lot since the Dayton Peace Agreement has been signed. It's changing rapidly. The EU has changed, the US has changed. What we have today is very different to what was there 30 years ago. The political actors in Bosnia have not changed so much. I mean, Dodik was there since 1996, and other political actors as well. So how do you see resolving this fast stream of changing global order, with a pretty less changing or rigid situation that we have in the country?
Yeah, thanks a lot. First of all, I did something I have not written in the article, but we're seeing more and more visibly over the last days, is that we may start probably what I said earlier, a fourth period, and this is with the change of policy by President Trump, something that is progressively apparent. And if my impression is right, that we are seeing also the USA shifting away from backing the High Representative, which was the main supporter over the last decade, it seems that the High Representative will be in a void without international supporters, and the EU on its own, totally on its own, to solve the Bosnian crisis, because it's the Bosnian situation, because crisis, I mean, more short term. So the only way forward I'm seeing is a strategy that has been presented since 2002, 2003, and this is the EU accession of the country. But although the strategy is known, it has never been consistently applied. The EU on several occasions have rewarded the lack of consistency and compliance on Bosnia's case, and the Bosnia's political system has not been engaged in the country's EU membership perspective. So the only way to somehow restore the process is by restoring belief in enlargement, and first to show the process is still alive and helping front runners, for example, Montenegro and Albania at this period of time, accede without any further delay on the assumption that they are fulfilling the last missing criteria. What I'm trying to say is here that if the EU advances on its own, and there is no other strategy than the EU accession, and the EU accession strategy will get meaningful if we are seeing that the process is working and some countries are moving forward. On that case, the pressure will be high on the Bosnian political elites because the dilemma will be whether Bosnia will be left behind or whether they will try to do the reforms, which many of the reforms essential for the country's progress are presented as EU accession reforms.
And let me come back to you last but not least, Vedran. You wrote a conclusion in this for the special edition, but you also participated in more than one discussion about 30 years of the Dayton Peace Agreement. And somehow you make this argument of Bosnia in the Dayton bubble being both resilient and crisis prone. So how do you see the situation?
Look, I mean, first of all, thank you for the special issue, and thanks also to the Southeast European Society for shedding a light on Bosnia and Herzegovina in a situation where this can be my first point. Actually, as someone who has experienced the 5th and the 10th and the 15th and the 20th and the 25th and now the 30th anniversary of Dayton, and as someone similar to Nikos, Nedžma, Sören, and Marika, all of us has written extensively on Bosnia and Herzegovina, quite often I have this feeling of being in a Groundhog Day scenario. So you wake up and you always see the same ethno-political forces, the same constitution, the same resilience to any change, the same EU reports asking for more reforms, but the reforms are not delivered, etc., etc. And here comes the paradoxy. Of course, you in the Groundhog Day, you wake up and you see always the same day. But Bosnia and Herzegovina wakes up in this kind of a same reality, while the world around is changing profoundly. So I mean, this is the paradox. The democracy is around. I mean, Hungary has changed from full-fledged democracy now to authoritarian state. Slovakia is on the same path. The Czech people just got a new government, which is probably going to change the approach to Brussels, but also change the approach to enlargement at all. So we have the rise of far right, etc., etc. And a colleague of mine just recently in Sarajevo at one of those conferences said, "Look, there is something about this Dayton that somehow works, and it keeps this kind of peace." And Sören, I'm totally with you, arguing actually that looking at all the possible cases of state building and nation building from the 90s onwards, Bosnia and Kosovo are probably the most two successful case studies when it comes to keeping the peace. But now, I mean, the question would be how to explain this paradoxy. I think one point which is in a way inscribed into Dayton that makes out this resilience but also produces problems at the same time is the virtue of, or the notion of, compromise. Even though the ethno-political forces are not good in delivering the ultimate compromise to let's say, enable country to be functional, to continue a speedy process towards the European integration, they do still engage or are forced to reach certain compromises, even though they are hard to reach, when it comes to daily life of institutions, to economic life, to, I don't know, be it visa-free travel back there, or right now the growth package, where they finally also delivered under a lot of pain, but they're delivered. So the kind of a compromise is still somehow inscribed into the tissue and creates this resilience. Of course, the compromises are too slow and too painful, which again makes a lot of people unhappy. But this is the paradoxy. The second point is the pluralism argument. So actually, the very complicated, protracted state structure of Bosnia and Herzegovina, with those sometimes interblocking institutions, keeps at least an artificial pluralism in Bosnia pulsating to a certain extent, as however you wish or not wish, you need to have these 10 cantons working with each other, and one canton cannot dominate another one. So then on the state level, you have the entities. You have actually a situation where no one can go and just change the state so profoundly that it ends up in an authoritarian, centralistic, highly hierarchical system like it happened in Serbia or in Hungary, for that matter. So basically, this is prohibiting the rise of those kind of authoritarian tendencies on a state level. And I think this is also sometimes something positive, but at the same time, again, the pluralism or plurality of institutions creates also a difficult situation, as no major reform can be delivered. And the third factor, just to mention this one, I think Dayton, if you just imagine Dayton as a room, it gives, paradoxically again, enough space for kind of different variations of Bosnian life to groups that probably in a different setup would not have that space. What do I mean by saying this kind of adaptability and variations within the Dayton room? So you do have the ethno-political parties, and they engage in clientelism, they steal money, they are corrupt, but at the same time, they can't kill the ordinary people's kind of interaction. They can't kill the notion of komshiluk, of good neighbor relations entirely. They can't kill the cultural spheres, music spheres, media spheres of multi-ethnicity and multiculturality going on, reaching out to Serbia, to Croatia, etc., etc. They can't kill actually the trans-ethnic initiatives fighting against environmental degradation, for example, etc., etc. Or they can't kill, if you wish, just to put it bluntly, they can't kill the tears of people. Just recently, when Halid Bešlić died, famous Bosnian singer, there were 250,000 people that came together in all Bosnian cities, but also in Serbia and Montenegro, in the diaspora, to actually sing his songs and to show actually that there is a room also for them beyond this kind of ethno-political political parties and then political elites. So these are kind of a few thoughts on this kind of a paradoxy of Dayton, hybridity that keeps it going, while actually also preventing a kind of a huge leap towards a more European Bosnia and Herzegovina.
Thank you very much for this overview. I just want to ask you, obviously the reality of Bosnia and Herzegovina is very complex today, but do you think it would have been different if there was no Dayton, or if international community withdrew from Bosnia 20 years ago? In other words, is the complexity just a result of the international presence, or is it also a reflection, genuine reflection of the native ways of functioning of Bosnia and Herzegovina and the Balkans.
Marika, is it to me or to all of us?
It's to you, but if other colleagues have a comment on this, yes, please feel free to jump in as well. But this was primarily
Look,
to
it's I mean, just a short thought on this one. I mean, we can't actually go back in time and try to imagine something that has something different than the reality that we live. But we can go back in time and ask ourselves what could have been done differently on the way, or what is actually leading to the reality that we have today. And of course, the international community, and I think Bosnia, the international community is an integral part of this paradoxy of resilience, but also of crisis-prone Bosnia and Herzegovina. I think Bosnia is very unique in this sense. So Bosnia, as a small country on the semi-periphery of Europe, or on the periphery of Europe, with this specific war and the involvement of international community in a time of the peak of the liberal world order of export of democracy, etc., etc. We just need to keep that in mind. It was totally different times back then in the 90s. With this international involvement, and with this semi-peripheral status of Bosnia and Herzegovina, I think that's the only way it can function. So we will always need certain type of international involvement, and hopefully, like Nikolaos just explained, it should become more and more a European involvement, as the US, as we see, is just taking itself out of the game, or playing some transactional games that we can't understand at this moment. So I think we need to look into the transformation of the international involvement, which poses two important questions. The first question is, what's the fate of the OHR? Because the OHR is a child of an era that doesn't exist anymore. And I certainly do believe that we need to, beyond the 5+2 reform agenda, that we need to move fast towards some kind of a different conditionality, European conditionality, probably without the US. I mean, we have to see how the transatlantic relationship develops, but we have to move fast towards that stage. And then the European involvement, which is also wanted by the citizens of Bosnia and Herzegovina, needs to be more democratic than the OHR. I think this is the next step. And of course, here, what will be crucial, and I just came here to this discussion, this is why I was late, from a discussion about enlargement in the German embassy with high officials from the Austrian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and high officials from Germany and from German Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I think there is a lot to do to make Montenegro, first of all, possible, but then also Albania. And of course, there is a huge elephant in the room, which is not the elephant, that's Ukraine, actually, that is driving the EU discussion right now. So I think, as it usually happens with the semi-periphery, the fate of Bosnia and the fate of this transition towards the European international involvement, stronger European international one, will be decided outside of Bosnia and Herzegovina.
Thank you very much for that. And Nikos, I mean, you wrote about international actors, and certainly we have not just the EU and the US, but we also have China and Russia and Turkey engaged in a way that wasn't the case 20 years ago or even 10 years ago. So how do you see this balance or disbalance of different international engagement, and in relation to the EU enlargement as well?
Yeah, I mean, all these actors were engaged from day one. I mean, China was the beginning of the Peace Implementation Council till it left, but it kept supporting and participating in the UN Security Council. Russia has always been in the Peace Implementation Council, and also Turkey. So there's nothing new to their engagement in the country. What is new is that we see this open divergence, which creates problems. And we're now following up on Vedran, we're going to a political/legal void. We have a high representative who doesn't have a UN Security Council mandate, endorsed mandate, contrary to what many will say in the West, all previously have been endorsed by the UN Security Council. We're having the United States that are leaving him behind, because we saw in the last debates that there was no mention to him. There's this usual sentence that the United States endorses, supports a high representative. It's something that we're hearing less and less. And while we don't know how he may be replaced politically, institutionally, because there's no process to replace him, at the same moment, he's there in place. And as I said earlier, he's openly challenged from all sides for doing too little or too much for all kinds of reasons. So it is very difficult to imagine the next day. Going to these actors that you mentioned earlier, putting Russia aside, all other countries are supporting the EU accession of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and they would like to see it moving forward. The problem is whether their activities are helping the country's EU accession, and what we are seeing is, for example, in the terms of economic deals, all these agreements signed, concluded at the level of leadership, are bypassing any, by EU standards, procurement rules or way of doing business in a country. So they are indirectly complicating Bosnia's EU accession, or to put it as Vedran said, they are financing a clientelistic system that existed already there, but remains in place and gets stronger over time. And while, as Vedran said, I will agree that we don't have in Bosnia a one-man show where a person such as Serbia rules the country, we have, in many respects, we have closer to what Sören calls a peace cartel, where the spoils are divided in three sides. So you don't have a person running the country, but you have the country divided more or less in three parts, where each of them is led by a side that exploits this deficiency, this erosion of the rule of law. Now, going back to Russia, Russia has very clearly is standing against the country's progress. Since 2022, it's aggressively confrontational towards all other countries. We saw even a threat by the Russian ambassador in Bosnia when there was a discussion about its NATO accession. We are knowing that there is malign activities on the ground, from the disinfo to the presence of and the formation of paramilitary, or call it whatever you want, armed groups in the country. We know that Bosnian people have been enlisted are fighting in Ukraine. So very clearly, Bosnia wants to have the possibility of a second front in Europe, but that's a totally different type of disruption as opposed to what China and Turkey does in the country, which to be a fallacy and an error from our side to group all these countries and treat them as a single external factor getting engaged in the country.
Thank you very much for saying that. And of course, they're not. I mean, when I asked you a question, I didn't mean to group them as one, as one single actor. But the fact is that they do have certain influence, as you just mentioned, on different pillars that are part of the liberal peace-building architecture, be it the market economy or or other aspects. So for you, Sören, I mean, a large part of the conversation is obviously about liberal peace building and whether it's on its way out or not just in Bosnia, but in other conflict zones as well. And that's how the concept of hybridity came into the picture. So how do you, what do you make of these? What do you make of these challenges of liberal peace, which is also becoming illiberal?
I think there are two dimensions here. The first one is, if we look at the active process of liberal peace building, I think this is dead, and it has been dead for some years. If we look at the global conflicts in the world, we do not see any more peace agreements, right? We've not seen a comprehensive peace agreement since 2015, since Nepal, I think is the last case certainly that I know of. We've not seen substantial ceasefires that have lasted. Where we have seen ends to conflict, it's usually because one side has won. Think about Syria last year, right? So this whole idea that we are seeing some kind of intervention, some kind of UN-led involvement in ending conflicts, mediated, negotiated agreements, I think that time is over. And that is replaced by short-term ceasefires, short-term kind of no escalation zones, short-term agreements on stalemates, but we're not seeing these kind of big interventions that we've seen in the Balkans in the 1990s, and then in Iraq, and to some extent in other countries in the early 2000s. I think that time is over. Now, that then raises the second question of what do we do with the cases where these interventions have happened and we had the long-term international involvement. And I think here Vedran was right that to many aspects, Bosnia is very unique in that, because we had a very short and successful intervention in North Macedonia, preventing the outbreak of larger violence. And with the exception of the north, one would say probably the rest of Kosovo is also relatively stable, right? American troops have all but removed themselves from Iraq. The country has, since the end of ISIS, seen a period of stability, right? So we don't have other cases where we have this high reliance on international support. So what does that mean for Bosnia? What does it mean for the future of peace building in Bosnia? Well, the theoretical argument I think both Vedran and Nikolaos have made is this idea that was always the aim and the objective to move from peace building to Europeanization. The EU would take over and it would extend the European sphere of peace to the Balkans, including to Bosnia, thereby kind of transforming peace building into kind of EU integration frameworks and contributing to stability through the EU's enlargement policy. But we also need to keep in mind this discussion, this is happening again today, is not new. We had this discussion 10 years ago. Right? One of the reasons why Schwarz-Schilling, when he became High Representative, was told not to use the bond powers, was to say now is the time to let EU conditionality and the kind of the carrot of EU membership, now let that do its magic. And 10 years later, we can say, well, that magic was not particularly inspiring. Now, what has changed, of course, is not Bosnia. I think Bosnia, if anything, is possibly worse than it was in 2006. But what, of course, has changed is the EU, right? Vedran hinted at this new enlargement momentum that came out of the Russian invasion and Russia's war of destruction against Ukraine. And out of that, the EU has changed, and EU enlargement has changed to a more geopolitical focus to say if we don't act here, we will have more conflicts and more violence and more destruction and more refugees at our borders. And that's not what we want, right? But even in that new environment, Bosnia has been very, very much struggling in utilizing that. Right? We are talking about Montenegro and Albania potentially joining anytime soon. We're not talking about this in Bosnia, right? We are talking about Bosnia even struggling to access the EU growth plan. We are struggling about, the EU had to close all eyes and cross all fingers and toes to accept the candidate status, kind of argument in Brussels being we gave it to Ukraine, we cannot not give it to Bosnia. Right, so there's nothing that is convincingly reform-oriented, moving closer to Brussels, coming out of Bosnia. Bosnia is treading along, so it's not utilizing this argument. So that raises the question of what needs to change. And again, there are several options. One argument is simply for the EU to make a complete realist geopolitical argument to say, look, the countries in the Balkans are small. They're not going to make a huge difference in the EU, so let's just absorb them all. Let's have them all join. Let's forget about the acquis. It's better to have them in than to have them out. They can cause less problems if they're in than if we leave them out and there's new conflicts. Now, of course, Hungary would tell us that if you're in, you can cause a lot of problems. So there might be people who might be worried, and the spoiler's probably not going to be Bosnia. The spoiler's probably going to be Serbia or other countries. But there are good arguments against that. What are other approaches? Some kind of fast track project where you say it might not be full EU membership, but some kind of integration light, access to the single market, getting some of the benefits of membership, such as free movement, everything but institutions. Problem for me is, do we really think this will spark some kind of reform agenda in Bosnia? I mean, whatever the EU offers will not tackle the problems in Bosnia. I think what needs to happen is to think about, okay, how do we tackle the problems in Bosnia if we say Bosnia as it is today is not ready to join the EU? And unless the EU is very serious about wanting to change that, it is very serious in engaging in some of the debates we had earlier, how do we overcome the adoption problem? I cannot see progress being made.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this. And I just want to say, I mean, I just want to put like two thoughts on the floor that's on issues that haven't been raised before. I think one change that we have seen, irrespective of the quality of the change, is that in the last few years, there are these new mobility agreements which have been designed and implemented under the Berlin process, which allow people in the region to move, recognition of diplomas, studying, working in all 6 Western Balkan countries, common regional market, which is also part of the Berlin process agenda. And I think my argument is always one achievement that has been made is actually connecting the citizens, including the citizens of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and in this way breaking down barriers, information barriers, which are imposed by the autocratic leaders that rule more than one of the Western Balkan countries. So on the one hand, we have a situation where maybe the relations between the Western Balkan countries plus the neighbors are improving, but then on the other hand, we're having a situation where a lot of the Bosnians are leaving the country, young people, brain drain, professionals, mid-level professionals who are moving abroad for the reasons of having a better life. So we are facing a situation where this big, umbrella political or EU accession agenda is shaping what Bosnia and Herzegovina is today. But then on the other hand, you have actually decreasing content on the inside in terms of the people who live there and in terms of the life that is being lived there. And if liberal peace building criticism goes to, among other things, that not focusing enough of the local, and Vedran has mentioned that. I think in Bosnia and Herzegovina, local is not just a folklore, it's actually how how the citizens connect to the state, which is the land, and it's the culture, and it's the history, and all of that. And if this aspect has been neglected and people leaving, we actually have, I would argue, an internal problem in the country that the EU accession agenda cannot address. And we don't know that actually Beja citizens are going to return into the country once, even if it becomes EU member state. And we have seen, for example, on the example of Croatia, where a large number of people have emigrated after Croatia became an EU member state. So where does it, where does this situation then leave us, Vedran?
I think this is an important question, and let's pick up on two specific aspects. First of all, migration. The migration has slowed down a bit. We would have this huge kind of 2013, 14, 15, as people would just go massively. During the Corona times, at least few came back. And now with the, inflation and difficulties in the core countries of the West, including Germany and Austria, particularly in the field of economy, many also good qualified people in the diaspora or those that moved out in the 2010s actually think of even coming back if. This is at least an option. So it has slowed down a bit, and I think many people realize actually that the Western light that shines less once you come and arrive in Germany and have to pay your taxes, which are huge, like in Austria or in Germany, and where you actually experience all the effects, negative effects of the economic difficulties that we have right now. But in any case, migration, we can't turn the wheel totally to pre-war or to just dreams. Migration is a fact. Migration is going to continue from all Southeastern Europe. But the crucial question is actually how to manage the migration flows, what to do and how to try to profit out of those huge actually potential of diaspora. And diaspora largely is interested in contributing. When I just think here of Vienna, in the recent 2, 3, 4 years following Corona pandemics, I've seen so many initiatives from young Bosnian people from diaspora trying to contribute to a kind of a pro-European or more functional Bosnia and Herzegovina. So my whole point about migration is this is a fact, and the Bosnian authorities, together with the people in the diaspora, should try to find a kind of a way of circular migration, how diaspora could contribute, and at the end of the day, if properly managed, the fact that Bosnia has a diaspora as big as the people that still live in country can become a kind of a strength of this kind of a transnational, trans-European, pan-European Bosnia and Herzegovina. We will never go back to the situation where we have 4.4 million people like before the war at the beginning of the 90s. I think this is the one point that is important. And the second point, I think we should in all these discussions around Bosnia open up the space for the Bosnia beyond Dayton Constitution, international community, OHR, even beyond European integration. So quite often we just tend to look at all this stuff top down and spend a lot of time in analyzing consociational agreements and setups and power sharing, which is all fine and all good. But just if we put a kind of try to look at Bosnia bottom up, following, let's say, look in the last 10 years. 2014, the Bosnian Spring, even if it failed in the end, has created a reservoir of knowledge, of let's say, democratic procedures like these public assemblies that is, let's say, today picked up by the Serbian students, for example. So stepping blocks. I mean, the solidarity in the floods 2014, but also the solidarity in the latest floods last year in Jablanica, where also people came to help. This is something. The failed, let's say, the failed Justice for David, Justice for Džanan protests shed light on high level of corruption. Many people remember it and profit from that one. And we should not forget that on a daily basis, even today, we do have young people, also joined by the people from diaspora, let's say, Karton Revolucija in Tuzla, fighting against environmental degradation. The ACT Foundation in Sarajevo that joined forces with Croatian colleagues to protect the river of Una in the western part of Bosnia. So there is a kind of a bottom-up grassroots sentiment among many people in Bosnia and Herzegovina and in diaspora that this is not the only way to go forward. Now, what we need to open up the space, the political space for those people and forces and engaged energies, is actually to undertake certain political steps to try to free the political arena of Bosnia and Herzegovina. And the first step is elections. I mean, elections do matter. And right now, I mean, we just faced the presidential elections in the Republic of Srpska, and at least in 3 communities, they were rigged, they were stolen. As the last elections in the Republic of Srpska 3.5 years ago were stolen. And I think now we are facing the next electoral cycle in October 2026. And I do see also more pragmatic forces in the Republic of Srpska, even though they are still nationalistic, but they still, I think they are more open for some kind of a compromise. I do see also significant changes coming up in the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina beyond HDZ. I think that's the responsibility of EU and of member states to take care in Bosnia and Herzegovina, but also in Serbia. And this is fundamental in 2026, if Vučić decides to go to elections late 2026, to take political care that the elections are free and fair, that you support those people that do think differently, and that to give a space for those kind of bottom-up forces actually to mushroom and to transform into more pragmatic and more democratic forces at the end that can, in the final consequence, lead to a totally different Bosnia, kind of a real utopian Bosnia in which I, as a Bosnian citizen, believe.
Thank you for that. And we had a few questions from the audience, and I think we actually addressed most of them or all of them in our discussion. But one issue, one of the participants here is asking, what about corruption as a glue for the elites on all 3 sides? Bosnia and Herzegovina is deeply involved in corruption and organized crime, which is not sustainable. So what about, and I think it ties actually to what you were just talking about, making sure that elections are fair and the elections are free. So how to overcome this problem of deeply embedded corruption and clientelism that actually runs the country to an extent. Either Nikos or Sören. Sören, do you want to pick up on this one?
I can say a few words, yeah. I mean, in my understanding, corruption is part of a wider problem, right? And it brings 2 issues together. On the one side, you have the huge issue of state capture, right? So Bosnia is a state that is captured by political elites at multiple levels, right? And here the central state isn't even the most important one. It's the entities and the cantons that matter, because this is where the money flows are, right? And as part of state capture, of course, we see forms of corruption that come with state capture, right? But corruption is also an issue for a weak state, right? Why do we have corruption? Well, on the one side, because we have state capture, right? We have more or less semi-legalized bodies where it is okay to be corrupt and where this is tolerated. And on the other side, we don't have an efficient police and judicial system that is fighting against that, right? So it brings together two very problematic issues. Now, how do you fight that? Well, some people will tell you it's about strengthening the judiciary, strengthening the police, strengthening corruption bodies, right? And this is what the EU has been focusing on. This is what many independent observers have focused on. This is what we're also seeing in other countries like Ukraine at the moment. And this is probably all nice and good, and it's very much inefficient, right? I mean, if we look at some countries, if we look at the indexes on like Transparency International, we can see it's not making a huge difference, right? So the EU sets up a huge independent judicial appointments body that should oversee judicial appointments. But in truth, it's as polarized and as much politically influenced as everything else in Bosnia, right? So therefore, whoever becomes a judge or prosecutor has to have support from political parties. Therefore, they are unlikely to fight corruption. So it seems to me that the key to deal with that, the secret is, and Vedran has said, elections and competition, right? Competition kills state capture. You need to allow for proper competition. Now, in Bosnia, this will not happen. You have a bit of competition and then everything goes away. But at the moment, you have competition of different state capture systems, right? Whether it's SDS against Dodik's party in Republika Srpska, or the different versions of HDZ, or SDR against some other parties in the Bosnia cantons. I don't think it'll take one or two elections to get rid of corruption and state capture, but I think the more competitive your elections are, the more you can fight corruption and this deep state control over key administrative services that we are seeing in Bosnia. So this is why Vedran is absolutely right. Where you have electoral fraud, that clearly needs to be pointed out. This is why it is important to focus on free and fair elections. This is why it is important that parties cannot be sure they will always win elections in their key power bases, because this is how you get deeply ingrained power structures that come with the corruption. This is why civil society is important, because they are the ones who make this official. They are the ones who publish this. They are the ones who can eventually tell the voter, look, don't vote for these guys again, because otherwise nothing will change, right? So there are mechanisms, and in some countries we have seen some progress in the fight against corruption, and based exactly on the argument of you need to increase electoral competition. And hopefully, as you increase electoral competition, you also see an improvement of the judiciary, of law enforcement, and of other anti-corruption policies.
Nikos, do you want to come in?
I would like to add to what Vedran and Sören said. I used before the term peace cartel, who has been introduced by Keil, which shows that what we have in Bosnia is the division of the country into three areas where the leadership takes the spoils. So I agree with Vedran's question and with Sören of democratization and of free elections, but at the same moment, the structure, the architecture of Dayton helps this consolidation of power. It is not accidental that the SDZ wants, with this question of legitimate representation, to make sure that can win all next elections, even if they are free and fair. If we have a reform on the direction of legitimate representation, any type of election will most probably show the domination. So there is an architectural problem with the country, which we have since the EECHR decision since 2009. We know it, and of course they don't want to resolve it. So having just free elections, the way the country is divided, will not only solve the problem, because it is certain that people from specific ethnicity will dominate the political power in the country and will help them to engage in such discourses. And there is a dissonance between what we're discussing generally today and generally, which is the problem of governmentality of Bosnia, and the real problem of the people. The problem of the people is the environmental degradation, which I was last week at this daily life of people. The PM 2.5 is several times above the limits. The problem of the people is a very low purchasing power. We spoke about migration. The problem is the rising price of real estate, which even Sarajevo has become expensive with the salaries that exist there. And by discussing about questions such as, the secession of Republika Srpska or the legitimate representation of the Croats or what this type of issues, we're evading, or about the HR and its role, we're evading to discuss about the problems of the people. And this is why I'm a bit more optimistic than Sören and Vedran, is that if Montenegro's EU accession materializes in Albania in the next couple of years, and if North Macedonia's road is unblocked, it will be very tough for the remaining countries, especially for Bosnia, because in Serbia you have anyhow a very low appreciation of the EU accession perspective at the present. But we're very hard in Bosnia and Herzegovina to resist the pressure, or maybe I'm wrong, to resist the pressure from the people that they should go do better than that. So that's why I'm hopeful about the EU accession, because at the present, everyone can say no one will ever accede and all this is in vain and the EU is fooling us. But what if the process was moving forward? That might be a change in the calculations of political elites in the region. It is no accident that last week the president of Serbia proposed the simultaneous accession of everyone because A, it's not possible, B, he can send somewhere else the blame, and C, this is rewarding the laggard as opposed to rewarding those who make an effort. So I'm still a bit idealist that if we unblock Montenegro and Albania and then North Macedonia, this can create pressure for the remaining regimes in the region.
Thank you very much for that. And I just want to add one issue that is not commonly mentioned in this discussion of corruption. Graft practices are deeply embedded in the Western Balkan societies. And it's normal, we grew up in socialism, and it was normal, you go to the doctor, you take a gift, you go to you want to pass an exam, you take a gift, etc. I think when we look at the local level or the citizens level, one of the problems is that actually people do not quite distinguish in cultural terms, or local informal institutional terms, that this difference between culturally embedded craft practices and the corruption on a much bigger level. And I think subconsciously we're having a situation where people, because they're used to these craft practices, they actually make an excuse, or they accept, or they recognize, but not act on corruption because it's perceived as something normal, and it's not just from post Dayton period, but it was there before. And I agree. I think Sören said the role of the civil society is actually, and of the NGO sector, is to actually educate people and work with people continuously to explain to them that, to look at these normals of everyday life, but how they shouldn't translate into the political sphere, and how they shouldn't interfere in the democratic sphere. I think with this we're coming to the end of our webinar today, and I would like to thank you all very much for contributing to this special edition, and to Southeast Europe Association for having us today talk about Bosnia and Herzegovina. And I'm really hoping that we can promise to stay engaged and to really do the best we can, as we have been doing up till now, to really help the country make the progress, not just Bosnia and Herzegovina, but the Western Balkans as well. To really hope that we don't have a similar kind of a conversation in a decade again, at 40 years of anniversary of signing the Dayton Peace Agreement. Thank you to our audiences for being with us today, and please feel free to contact us via email or via Southeast Europe Association if you have any additional questions for us. And of course, please do read the special edition, and wishing you a very happy holiday season. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Merry
Thank you very
Christmas,
much.
Thanks a
everybody.
lot.
Thanks,
All the
everyone. Bye,
best.
everyone.